My name is Joanna, and at 34 years old, I'm standing in my penthouse office, staring at desperate voicemails from the family who threw me away 8 years ago. They're facing homelessness now after my sister's web of lies finally strangled them. The same people who called me dead to them are begging for salvation from the daughter they chose to destroy. They believed her fabricated story without questioning anything. Before I share how karma finally delivered justice, let me know where you're watching from. If you've ever been betrayed by family, hit that subscribe button and like this video. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this played out. Growing up in suburban Minneapolis, I thought we had the perfect American family. My mother, Margaret, taught third grade at the local elementary school, always preaching about honesty and integrity to her students. My father, Richard, worked as an accountant for a regional firm, proud of his attention to detail and ability to spot discrepancies in numbers. We lived in a two-story colonial house with a white picket fence, the kind of place where neighbors brought casseroles when someone was sick, and everyone knew each other's names. My older sister Diane was 3 years ahead of me, and from the moment I could form memories, she was the golden child. While I spent Friday nights studying for my advanced placement exams, Diane was at parties coming home past curfew with alcohol on her breath. My parents would ground her for a day, maybe two, then laugh about her wild spirit at Sunday dinner. When I brought home my report card with straight A's, they'd pat my head and say good job. When Diane managed to pull a C average, they threw a celebration dinner at her favorite steakhouse. I started working at 16 bagging groceries at the local supermarket every weekend and after school. My paychecks went straight into my college savings account. By the time I was 18, I had saved $15,000. Meanwhile, Diane had crashed 2 cars both times driving under the influence. The first time my parents hired an expensive lawyer to get the charges reduced to reckless driving. The second time they paid off the other driver to keep quiet and bought Diane a brand new car the next week. The pattern was always the same. Diane would create chaos and my parents would rush to clean it up. She'd steal money from my wallet, and when I complained, they'd tell me I must have miscounted. She'd borrow my clothes without asking, ruin them, and my mother would say, "Sisters share everything." When she spread rumors about me at school, saying I was weird and antisocial, my parents told me to be more like her, more outgoing and fun. I remember the night I got my acceptance letter to Northwestern University. I had earned a partial scholarship for their business program, and I was shaking with excitement when I showed my parents. My father glanced at it during a commercial break, said that was nice, and went back to watching television. My mother reminded me not to get too proud, that humility was important. That same evening, Diane announced she was engaged to Todd Morrison, heir to a chain of luxury car dealerships across the Midwest. The house erupted in joy. My mother actually cried, clutching Diane to her chest and saying she'd always dreamed of this day. My father opened a bottle of champagne he'd been saving for a special occasion. My acceptance to one of the top universities in the country warranted a distracted nod. Diane's engagement to money warranted champagne. Todd was actually a decent guy, which surprised me. He was intelligent, kind, and genuinely seemed to love my sister despite her obvious flaws. At their engagement party, held at the Morrison family's country club, Todd found me reading in the library while everyone else was dancing. He sat down next to me and said he admired how hard I worked, that Diane had told him about my acceptance to Northwestern. He said intelligence and drive were rare qualities that his family's business succeeded because his grandmother had those same traits. It was the first time anyone in my family's social circle had acknowledged my achievements as valuable. Diane found us talking 20 minutes later. Her face was flushed from champagne, but her eyes were sharp and cold. She wrapped herself around Todd's arm, laughing too loudly about how boring I was, always hiding away with books instead of enjoying life. Todd looked uncomfortable, tried to say something nice about education being important, but Diane pulled him away. As they left, she looked back at me and whispered something that made my blood run cold. She said I always tried to steal her spotlight, but she'd never let that happen. I didn't understand what she meant then. I was just the boring little sister who studied too much and worked too hard. I had never competed with her for anything. We lived in completely different worlds. She had the social life, the engagement, the parental adoration. I had my books, my job, and my dreams of building something meaningful with my life. I thought that was enough separation to keep us from colliding. 3 months before my college graduation, everything I had built began to crumble, and I didn't even see it coming. The spring semester of my senior year at Northwestern was supposed to be my victory lap. I had secured a position at Deloitte starting in the fall, graduated summa cum laude, and was selected to give a speech at the business school commencement. My professors wrote glowing recommendation letters, calling me one of the most promising students they'd encountered in years. I was 22 years old and exactly where I had planned to be. That April, Todd called me unexpectedly. His voice was strained, exhausted. He asked if we could meet for coffee when I was home for spring break. He said he needed advice from someone who understood Diane but could be objective. I agreed, thinking maybe they were having typical pre-marriage issues that needed a sister's perspective. We met at a quiet coffee shop downtown Minneapolis. Todd looked like he'd aged 5 years since the engagement party 2 years prior. His hands shook as he told me about Diane's shopping addiction, how she'd maxed out 7 credit cards he didn't know existed. He showed me bank statements with charges for designer bags, jewelry, spa treatments costing thousands of dollars per week. She had also been having affairs, at least 3 that he knew about, with men she met at the country club. Todd wasn't angry, just devastated. He said he loved the woman he thought Diane was, but that person seemed to never have existed. He asked me directly if Diane had always been this way, if the manipulation and lies were new, or if he'd been blind. I told him the truth, that Diane had always taken what she wanted and faced no consequences. I shared stories from our childhood, the pattern of destruction followed by parental protection. He thanked me for my honesty and said he was planning to file for divorce after consulting with his attorney. I told him I was sorry it had come to this, but that he deserved better. We hugged briefly in the parking lot, a moment of human compassion between 2 people hurt by the same person. What neither of us knew was that Diane had followed him there and taken pictures from her car across the street. 2 weeks later, my world exploded. I was in my apartment in Evanston finalizing my valedictorian speech when my phone rang. It was my mother, and she was screaming. Not upset, not disappointed, but screaming with rage. She called me names I'd never heard her use, words that felt like physical blows. When I finally got her to slow down enough to understand, she said Diane had shown them everything. The affair I'd been having with Todd for months, the text messages I'd sent him, the photos of us together. I felt the floor drop out from under me. There was no affair. There were no text messages. But Diane had created them. She'd used a spoofing application to generate fake conversations between Todd and me, messages so graphic and detailed that reading them later made me physically sick. She'd edited photos from family gatherings, cropping them to make innocent moments look intimate. A photo of Todd and me talking at Christmas became evidence of secret romance when she removed the 5 other people who'd been standing with us. My father called next, his voice cold and measured. He said I was no longer his daughter. 22 years of being the perfect child, and he discarded me based on fabricated evidence he never questioned. He told me my things would be on the lawn of their house in 2 hours, and if I didn't collect them, they'd be burned. No discussion, no opportunity to defend myself. No trial, just immediate execution. I drove to Minneapolis in a haze, my mind unable to process what was happening. When I arrived at my childhood home, my belongings were indeed on the lawn in garbage bags. Photo albums, childhood toys, clothes, everything that proved I had ever existed in that house. Neighbors were watching from their windows as I loaded my car, my mother standing in the doorway to make sure I didn't try to come inside. I begged her to listen. I showed her my actual phone with no messages to Todd. I showed her my location history, proving I wasn't where Diane claimed I'd been. I even called Todd on speaker, where he desperately tried to explain that Diane was lying, that our meeting was about his divorce, nothing more. My mother's response was to slam the door in my face. The destruction didn't stop there. Diane posted her fictional story on social media, tagging our extended family, my friends, even my future employer. She painted herself as the victim of the ultimate betrayal, her own sister sleeping with her husband. The likes and supportive comments poured in. My aunt commented that she'd always thought I was jealous. My high school friends shared the post with angry reactions. Within 48 hours, I received a call from Deloitte's Human Resources Department. They were rescinding their job offer due to concerns about my character and the potential damage to their reputation. I tried calling Todd to coordinate our defense, but Diane had anticipated this. She told him if he supported my version of events, she'd file abuse charges against him, claiming he'd been violent throughout their relationship. She had already started spreading this narrative to his family's business associates. The Morrison family lawyers advised him to stay quiet and settle the divorce quickly to minimize damage. He sent me one text before blocking my number. "I'm sorry. I have to protect my family's business." My college friends distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. My professors who had once praised me grew cold and professional. The university couldn't revoke my degree, but they quietly removed me from the speaking program at graduation. The explanation was scheduling conflicts, but everyone knew the truth. I walked across that stage to receive my diploma in front of empty chairs. My family didn't come. Most of my friends didn't come. I had achieved everything I'd worked for, and there was no one to witness it. 3 days after graduation, I sat in my car outside a homeless shelter in Chicago. I had my degree, my car, $2,000 in my checking account, and nothing else. No family, no friends, no job, no references I could use without explaining why the golden student had become radioactive. Diane had executed her destruction perfectly, and everyone I'd ever loved had helped her do it. The shelter was full that night. They turned me away. The first night sleeping in my car taught me that rock bottom has a basement. I parked in the lot of a 24-hour laundromat in Cicero, hoping the constant activity would make it safer. Every hour I'd wake up in panic, thinking someone was trying to break in. My neck ached from the awkward angle against the window. My stomach cramped from hunger, but I knew my $2,000 had to last until I found work. I developed a routine for survival. The Planet Fitness in Oak Park had a trial membership for 7 days. I'd shower there at 5 in the morning when it was empty, trying to look like an early morning fitness enthusiast rather than someone who had nowhere else to clean themselves. I'd wash my interview clothes in the sink and hang them in my car to dry, praying they wouldn't smell like mildew when I wore them. The public library became my office. I'd apply for jobs using their computers, writing cover letters that somehow had to explain why a Northwestern graduate with a 3.9 GPA had no references and no work history anyone could verify. I created a new email address, a new phone number through a free app, trying to disappear from the digital assassination Diane continued to wage. Every few days, I'd check social media from a fake account and see new posts about my betrayal, fresh reminders to anyone who might have forgotten that I was persona non grata. Food was rice and beans from the dollar store cooked on a camping stove I bought at Goodwill. One meal a day, carefully portioned to provide just enough calories to keep going. I lost 20 pounds in 6 weeks. My clothes hung loose professional blazers that once made me look capable, now drowning my shrinking frame. The stress made my hair fall out in clumps. I'd find strands on my pillow, which was actually a rolled-up sweater. 2 months into homelessness, my body gave up before my spirit did. I collapsed in the parking lot of a Walmart while walking to submit yet another job application. The heat exhaustion combined with malnutrition finally overwhelmed my system. I woke up to a woman's face hovering over me, speaking rapid Spanish and pressing a cold bottle of water to my lips. Maria Rodriguez owned a food truck called Abuela's Kitchen. She was 60 years old, built like a linebacker, with hands that could either comfort you or knock you flat, depending on what you needed. She took one look at me unconscious in a parking lot wearing a business suit and decided I needed both. She helped me to her truck, fed me the best meal I'd eaten in months, and didn't ask questions until I'd finished every bite. When I finally told her my story, she listened without judgment. Then she offered me a deal. She needed someone who understood numbers to fix her bookkeeping disaster. In exchange, she'd pay me in meals and let me sleep in the storage area behind her truck. It wasn't legal, probably wasn't safe, but it was better than my car. I spent 3 months living in a space the size of a closet, surrounded by boxes of rice and cans of beans, doing Maria's books by flashlight after she closed each night. Maria's food truck was parked near a startup incubator in Fulton Market. One day, a young entrepreneur named Daniel Park tried to pay for his tacos with an app that crashed. While his team panicked about their demo failing, I fixed the bug in their payment code. It was simple, a misplaced bracket causing an infinite loop. Daniel offered me a job on the spot. Minimum wage, no benefits. But it was legitimate work at a tech company that didn't care about my past as long as I could code. I worked 80-hour weeks at that startup, sleeping under my desk most nights because I still couldn't afford rent in Chicago. My coworkers thought I was just dedicated. They didn't know I literally had nowhere else to go. I automated systems, streamlined processes, turned their chaos into order. When investors came for demos, I was the one who made sure everything worked. 6 months in, they promoted me to operations manager with a salary that finally let me afford a studio apartment. It was 400 square feet with bars on the windows and a radiator that sounded like it was dying, but it was mine. The first night in that apartment, I sat on the floor and cried for 3 hours. Not from sadness, but from relief. I had an address. I had a door that locked. I had survived. Meanwhile, through Kevin, a mutual acquaintance from high school who still felt guilty about believing Diane's lies, I heard updates about my family. Diane was living lavishly, having taken Todd for everything in the divorce. She'd moved back in with our parents, claiming she needed their support to heal from her trauma. The woman who destroyed my life was being coddled like a wounded bird. My parents had started telling people I had moved to Europe for work, too ashamed to admit they'd disowned me, but also too proud to acknowledge they might have been wrong. They'd sold their house, downsizing to a smaller place to help support Diane's lifestyle. She'd convinced them she was starting a wellness business, a healing center for women who'd been betrayed. The irony was so thick you could choke on it. Kevin told me Diane had a new boyfriend, Marcus Winters, who seemed different from her usual targets. He asked a lot of questions, seemed particularly interested in Diane's past relationships and business dealings. Kevin thought it was strange how Marcus would sometimes photograph documents when Diane wasn't looking, but everyone assumed he was just thorough about getting to know his girlfriend. I threw myself into work to avoid thinking about them. The startup grew from 10 employees to 50. My systems saved them $2 million in the first year. The CEO, Jennifer Chen, became my mentor. She was a 45-year-old former Google executive who'd risked everything to build something new. When she asked about my background, I told her the truth. She listened, nodded, and said everyone deserved a second act. Jennifer taught me about venture capital, market analysis, strategic growth. She paid for me to complete my MBA online while working, saying it was an investment in the company's future. She didn't know she was saving my life one lesson at a time. Under her guidance, I started consulting for other startups on the side, building a reputation as someone who could solve impossible problems. 2 years after living in my car, I incorporated my own consulting firm. My 28th birthday arrived with no fanfare except a card from Maria that said, "Proud of you, mija," and a chocolate cake she insisted on making despite my protests. I spent the day like any other, 12 hours deep in spreadsheets for 3 different clients, building systems that would save them millions. My consulting firm, Phoenix Operations Solutions, had just closed its first year with $500,000 in revenue. The name wasn't subtle, but I didn't care. I had risen from ashes, and every client who hired me got someone who understood what it meant to build something from absolute nothing. My specialty was helping failing startups restructure before bankruptcy, probably because I knew intimately what it felt like to lose everything and still find a way forward. Jennifer had become my first major advocate, recommending me to every founder in her network. She'd introduce me as the operations genius who saved her company conveniently, leaving out that she'd found me sleeping under my desk. The Silicon Valley transplants in Chicago's tech scene didn't care about Midwest suburban drama. They cared that I could turn their burn rate from a death sentence into a growth strategy. I hired my first employee that year, a brilliant developer named James, who'd aged out of foster care and taught himself to code in libraries. My second hire was Natasha, a single mother who'd been laid off after 15 years at a corporation that decided her position was redundant. My third was Robert, fresh out of prison for a nonviolent drug offense, trying to rebuild his life with the coding skills he'd learned inside. We were a team of people who'd been written off, and we worked like our lives depended on it, because they did. My apartment upgraded from the studio with bars on the windows to a 2-bedroom in Lincoln Park. Nothing fancy, but it had a doorman and laundry in the unit, luxuries I'd never take for granted again. I bought furniture piece by piece, each purchase a small victory. A real bed instead of an air mattress. A couch that didn't come from an alley. A dining table where I could spread out work without using the floor. Maria came for dinner every Sunday, teaching me recipes while complaining I was too skinny. She'd become the mother I'd lost, fierce and protective and endlessly proud. When I tried to pay her back for those months of shelter and food, she threw the check in my face and threatened to hit me with a spatula. She said family doesn't keep score, and I was her family now whether I liked it or not. Through Kevin's updates, I learned my parents had moved again this time to a one-bedroom apartment in the suburbs. Diane's wellness center had failed before it started burning through their savings on yoga studio leases she never occupied and equipment she sold for pennies on the dollar. She'd convinced them it was the economy's fault that her vision was just too advanced for Midwest sensibilities. They believed her, of course. They always did. Diane's new boyfriend Marcus was still around, which surprised everyone. Her relationships usually lasted 6 months maximum, just long enough to extract whatever value she could. But Marcus seemed to have his own money, his own connections. He asked strange questions at family dinners about Diane's past businesses, her relationships always framing it as interest in her journey. My parents found him delightful. What they didn't know was that Marcus Winters wasn't his real name. The expansion of Phoenix Operations Solutions continued exponentially. Year 2 brought in $1.5 million in revenue. Year 3 hit $3.8 million. By year 4, we had 30 employees and offices in Chicago, Minneapolis, and Milwaukee. I was 32 years old and running a multi-million-dollar company. Forbes wanted to do a feature on young entrepreneurs. I declined. I wasn't ready for that level of visibility yet. My employees didn't know my full story, but they knew I understood struggle. When James's grandmother got sick, I gave him 3 months paid leave and hired a private nurse. When Natasha's son got into MIT but couldn't afford it, Phoenix Operations Solutions created a scholarship that happened to match his exact tuition needs. When Robert's parole officer tried to violate him for missing a meeting due to a client emergency, I hired the best lawyer in Chicago to fight it. We became known in the startup world as the firm that could fix anything. Bleeding money. We'd find it and stop it. Team falling apart. We'd rebuild it stronger. Investors losing faith. We'd give them reasons to double down. My personal cell phone became a hotline for founders at the end of their rope, and I answered every call because I remembered when no one answered mine. Jennifer joined my board of directors, bringing with her connections to venture capital firms that started sending all their struggling portfolio companies to us. Maria incorporated her food truck business properly and became our official catering service because every crisis meeting went better with her tamales. The family I'd built was unconventional, but it was mine. Then Todd Morrison called me for the first time in 6 years. His voice was different, lighter somehow. He was remarried with a baby daughter living in Seattle, running his own electric vehicle company. He'd left the family dealership business wanting something that was entirely his. He apologized for abandoning me when Diane's lies destroyed my life, said he'd been a coward choosing his reputation over the truth. But that wasn't why he was calling. He'd hired a private investigator to look into Diane 2 years ago, wanting to clear his name for his daughter's sake, so she'd never Google her father and find those lies. The investigator's name was Marcus Winters, and he'd been playing the long game, gathering evidence of Diane's crimes while pretending to be her devoted boyfriend. Todd asked if I was sitting down. Then he told me what Marcus had found. Marcus Winters, whose real name was Marcus Thompson, had initially approached Todd with skepticism. Private investigators saw a lot of bitter divorces, where both parties claimed victimhood. But the deeper he dug into Diane's history, the more he realized Todd's story wasn't just true. It was one chapter in a serial novel of destruction. The spoofing application Diane used to create fake text messages between Todd and me was just the beginning. Marcus found 17 different email accounts she'd created to impersonate various people. She'd destroyed a coworker's marriage by sending explicit emails to the woman's husband from a fake affair partner. She'd gotten a college roommate expelled by submitting plagiarized papers in the girl's name. She'd even created a fake charity for autism awareness, collected $30,000 in donations, and spent it on a trip to Cabo. But the most shocking discovery was what she'd done to our parents. Over the past 4 years, while living under their roof as the wounded daughter healing from betrayal, Diane had systematically drained their finances. She'd convinced them to put her name on their accounts to help manage their bills while they dealt with the trauma of losing me. Then she'd taken out home equity loans against their house without telling them, forging their signatures with practiced ease. She'd opened credit cards in their names, maxing them out on luxury goods she resold online. She'd even sold their life insurance policies to a third party for quick cash, telling them the policies had lapsed due to missed payments. Marcus had receipts for everything. Bank statements, forged documents, security footage of Diane at ATMs withdrawing money from accounts that weren't hers. He'd spent 2 years pretending to love her while building a case that would destroy her. He'd recorded conversations where she bragged about her schemes, thinking she was impressing him with her cleverness. He had her on video practicing our mother's signature, laughing about how easy it was to manipulate people who trusted you. The FBI had been building a case for 6 months. Wire fraud, mail fraud, identity theft, money laundering through the fake charity. Diane was looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison. They were waiting for one more piece of evidence, something that would guarantee conviction, and Marcus was close to getting it. Todd wanted to warn me because when the arrest happened, it would be public. The local news would cover it. Our family's destruction would be entertainment for strangers. He wanted me to be prepared to maybe reach out to our parents before they learned the truth from federal agents. He thought I might want to be the bigger person to offer them comfort in their darkest hour. I thanked him for the warning and hung up. Then I sat in my office looking out at the Chicago skyline from the 20th floor of a building I could never have afforded to enter 8 years ago, and felt absolutely nothing. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just a hollow echo where family love used to live. 3 weeks later, Marcus got his final piece of evidence. Diane had been planning to murder our parents. She'd increased their life insurance policies, using forged documents, making herself the sole beneficiary of $2 million each. She'd been researching untraceable poisons online using a laptop she thought was secure. She'd even started adding small amounts of antifreeze to their food, not enough to kill immediately, but enough to cause gradual organ failure that would look like natural decline in an elderly couple. The FBI moved immediately. They arrested Diane at our parents' apartment during Sunday dinner, right in the middle of the pot roast she'd made with just a little extra special ingredient. The agents had to physically restrain our father when they told him about the poisoning. Our mother collapsed and had to be taken to the hospital for observation. The local news had their story of the year. The headline was everywhere by Monday morning: local woman arrested for attempted murder of parents. Dozens of fraud victims come forward. Diane's mugshot showed her perfectly made-up face, twisted in rage, screaming about being set up, demanding to speak to Marcus, who she still thought was her boyfriend. The news interviewed victims going back 15 years, people whose lives she'd destroyed for money or just for fun. My phone started ringing at 6 a.m. First, Kevin, barely able to speak through his shock. Then Jennifer, offering to handle any media requests. Then Maria, asking if I needed her to come over with food and a baseball bat, though she didn't specify what the bat was for. Then numbers I didn't recognize, reporters who'd somehow connected me to the story. But the calls I noticed were the ones that weren't coming. 8 years of silence from my parents, and even now, with their world collapsed and their daughter revealed as a monster who'd tried to kill them, they didn't call. Their pride was stronger than their need for the only child they had left. Then Tuesday arrived, and with it the first voicemail. My mother's voice was barely recognizable, aged and broken and desperate. She said she needed to talk to me, that they'd made a terrible mistake, that they knew the truth now about everything. She cried through the entire message, 30 seconds of pure anguish that might have moved me if it hadn't come 8 years too late. Wednesday brought my father's voicemail, more composed but equally desperate. He said they were facing bankruptcy, that the FBI had frozen all accounts connected to Diane's crimes, that they had nowhere to go when the apartment lease ended in 30 days. He said I was their daughter, that family helped family, that blood was thicker than water. I wanted to call back and remind him that blood meant nothing when he put my belongings on the lawn like garbage. Water would have been thicker than the family bond he severed with surgical precision. By Thursday, the voicemails had evolved from apologetic to entitled. My mother said I had an obligation to help them, that they'd raised me, paid for my childhood, given me everything. My father reminded me that successful people had a duty to care for their parents, that abandoning them would reflect poorly on my character. Friday brought extended family into the mix. My Aunt Catherine, who'd commented on Diane's original post that she'd always known I was jealous, now called to say she'd always suspected Diane was troubled. My Uncle Raymond, who'd blocked me 8 years ago, sent a text saying family should stick together through difficult times. Cousins I hadn't heard from since high school suddenly remembered we were related. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I called my lawyer and had her pull together a complete picture of my parents' financial situation. The numbers were staggering. $400,000 in debt, most of it from loans Diane had taken in their names. Their credit was destroyed. They had no savings, no assets except a 10-year-old Honda Civic worth maybe $3,000. They were 71 and 69 years old, respectively, facing homelessness with no safety net except the daughter they'd thrown away. The irony was that I could solve their problems with a single check. $400,000 was significant, but not devastating to my current wealth. I could pay off their debts, set them up in a nice apartment, make sure they were comfortable for their remaining years. It would be the easiest thing in the world to be their savior. Instead, I made a different call. The meeting was set for 2 weeks after Diane's arrest at the Chicago Public Library's main branch, Harold Washington Library Center. I chose it specifically because it had been my refuge during the worst days of homelessness, where I'd hidden in the stacks to stay warm, where I'd used the computers to apply for jobs that never called back. It seemed fitting to face my parents in a place that had sheltered me when they wouldn't. I arrived early, settling into a study room on the 3rd floor with glass walls visible but private. I'd dressed carefully, professionally, but not ostentatiously, in a navy suit that fit perfectly, because I could afford tailoring now. My hair was healthy again, my weight restored, my hands steady. I looked like the successful businesswoman I'd become, not the broken girl they'd discarded. They arrived 15 minutes late, moving slowly, cautiously, like they were entering hostile territory. The years hadn't been kind to them even before Diane's betrayal. My mother's hair was completely gray, her face mapped with lines that spoke of worry and regret. My father had lost weight, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that used to carry authoritative presence. They looked like refugees from their own lives. When they saw me through the glass, my mother started crying immediately. My father had to guide her into the room, his own eyes wet with tears I'd never seen him shed before. They sat across from me at the conference table, the same distance that had existed between us for 8 years, compressed into 3 feet of polished wood. My mother reached for my hands. I pulled them back. She started with the apologies, words tumbling over each other in a desperate rush. She was sorry, so sorry they'd been fools. They'd been blind. They'd failed as parents. They'd believed the wrong daughter. They'd thrown away the good one. They'd never forgive themselves. They'd do anything to make it right. Anything at all. My father was more measured but equally desperate. He said they understood if I hated them that they deserved my hatred. But blood was blood, and family was family. He said they'd learned their lesson about Diane, about trust, about judgment. He promised they would never doubt me again, never choose anyone over me again, never abandon me again. I let them talk for 20 minutes, watching them the way I'd learned to watch clients who were trying to sell me on saving their failing companies, looking for truth beneath the desperation, sincerity beneath the self-preservation. What I saw were 2 people who were genuinely sorry that their choices had led them to this moment, but I wasn't convinced they were sorry for the choices themselves. When they finally ran out of words, I opened the folder I'd brought with me. Inside were photographs Maria had taken during my first months at her food truck. Pictures of me unconscious in a parking lot, being lifted into an ambulance because dehydration and starvation had shut my body down. Medical records from the emergency room visit showing severe malnutrition, a body weight that had dropped to 93 pounds, hair loss consistent with extreme stress. I showed them the rejection letters from jobs, over 200 of them, each one citing concerns about my character or reputation. I showed them screenshots of Diane's social media posts, the ones they'd liked, and shared, spreading lies about me to thousands of people. I showed them the lease for the storage unit, where I'd kept my belongings because I was living in my car, the receipt for the camping stove I'd used to cook beans in parking lots, the gym membership I'd bought just to have somewhere to shower. Then I showed them my company's financial statements, the contracts with Fortune 500 companies, the articles in business journals calling me a operational genius, the scholarship fund I'd created for students estranged from their families, the homeless shelter I'd donated to the one that had been too full to take me in when I needed it most, the life I'd built without them, despite them, in defiance of everything they'd tried to take from me. My mother was sobbing by then, ugly, wrenching sounds that might have broken my heart if it hadn't already been shattered and rebuilt without space for them. My father just stared at the papers, his accountant's mind processing the numbers, understanding the gulf between where they were and where I was, between what they'd thrown away and what they were begging to get back. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady, professional, the tone I used to deliver bad news to clients. I told them I remembered every word they'd said to me 8 years ago, that I was dead to them, that I was no longer their daughter, that my very existence disgusted them. I asked if they remembered saying those things, and they couldn't meet my eyes. I told them about sleeping in my car in winter, about waking up with ice on the inside of the windows, about being so hungry I'd eaten ketchup packets from fast food restaurants. I told them about applying for jobs at McDonald's and being rejected because my Northwestern degree made me overqualified, but my reputation made me unemployable anywhere else. I told them about considering suicide on the bridge over the Chicago River, about choosing to live not because I had hope, but because I refused to let Diane win that completely. Then I told them about Maria finding me, about Jennifer believing in me, about James and Natasha and Robert, and all the people who'd become my family when my blood relatives became my enemies. I told them about building my company, one client at a time, one 16-hour day at a time, one small victory at a time. I told them about success that tasted sweeter because I'd earned it alone, about wealth that meant more because I'd started from negative nothing. My father tried to interrupt to say they'd been deceived, that Diane had manipulated them, that they were victims too. I laughed, a sharp sound that made him flinch. I reminded him that he was an accountant trained to verify numbers, to check sources, to demand proof. He'd applied none of those skills when Diane accused me. He'd chosen to believe her because it was easier than questioning his favorite daughter. My mother tried a different approach, saying they'd already been punished enough, that losing everything to Diane was karma for what they'd done to me. She said they'd learned their lesson, that they'd never make the same mistake again. She begged me not to become like them, not to abandon family when they needed help most. That's when I pulled out the final document from my folder. It was a single page, a bank statement showing a transfer of $400,000 to the homeless shelter that had turned me away 8 years ago. The exact amount of my parents' debt donated in their names to help people who actually had nowhere else to turn. The donation would be announced at the shelter's gala next month, with a plaque thanking Richard and Margaret Sullivan for their generous support of the homeless community. I told them they'd always have that, the knowledge that their debt had helped people who deserved help. But they wouldn't have me. They wouldn't have my money, my connections, my forgiveness, or my presence in their lives. They'd made their choice 8 years ago when they put my belongings on the lawn. I was just honoring their decision. My mother became hysterical then, begging, pleading, offering anything if I'd just reconsider. She said they'd die on the streets, that they were too old to start over, that I was sentencing them to homelessness. I reminded her that I'd been 22 when they sentenced me to the same thing, and I'd survived. They had each other, which was more than I'd had. They'd figure it out or they wouldn't, but either way, it wasn't my problem. My father's mask finally cracked completely. He called me heartless, cruel, said I'd become a monster worse than Diane. He said success had made me cold, that money had replaced my soul, that he was glad they'd disowned me because I'd become someone worth disowning. It was fascinating watching him return to his true nature when manipulation failed the real man beneath the desperate apologies. I stood to leave, gathering my documents with the same calm precision I used to close failed business deals. At the door, I turned back one last time. I told them that Diane had tried to poison them slowly, adding antifreeze to their food in small doses, watching them decline while playing the devoted daughter. I asked them to consider that they'd done the same thing to me, just with emotional poison instead of chemical. The only difference was that I'd found the antidote in people who actually loved me. The last thing I said before walking out was that they'd taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. They'd shown me that family was just a word, that DNA was just biology, that the people who truly matter were the ones who showed up when showing up was hard. They'd taught me that by showing me exactly who they were when I had nothing to offer. I thanked them for that lesson, and I left. Walking out of that library felt like exhaling after holding my breath for 8 years. The Chicago afternoon was crisp autumn air carrying the promise of change, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing it in. My phone was buzzing with messages from my real family. Maria asking if I needed backup. Jennifer offering to buy every drink in Chicago, James sending funny memes to make me smile without even knowing why I might need them. The $400,000 I donated to the shelter wasn't just about irony or karma. It was about transformation, turning my parents' debt into something meaningful. The shelter director had called me personally crying as she explained how the donation would let them expand their capacity, add mental health services, create job training programs. People would be housed because my parents were not. Lives would be saved because mine had been discarded. 3 days after the library meeting, my parents moved in with distant relatives in Nebraska, an elderly couple who needed caretakers in exchange for room and board. My mother got a job at Walmart, my father at a tax preparation service. They were 71 and 69 years old, starting over in a town where nobody knew their story, working minimum wage jobs to afford basic necessities. They were living my life from 8 years ago, except they had each other and a roof over their heads, which was still more than they'd left me with. Diane's trial became a media sensation. 27 victims testified against her, each story more horrifying than the last. She'd destroyed careers, marriages, families, all for money or entertainment, or just because she could. Marcus Thompson testified for 3 days, playing recordings of Diane laughing about her crimes, bragging about how stupid people were to trust her, planning the murder of our parents, like she was organizing a dinner party. She was convicted on all counts. The judge, a stern woman who'd seen enough to rarely be shocked, called Diane a predator who'd weaponized trust and love. The sentence was 23 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole for 15. When they led her away, Diane screamed that it was my fault, that I'd orchestrated everything, that I was the real criminal. Even facing decades in prison, she couldn't stop lying. Todd sent me a letter after the trial. He'd named his daughter Joanna, he wrote, because he wanted her to grow up knowing that strength wasn't about never falling, but about getting up when everyone thought you'd stay down. He included a picture of little Joanna, 6 months old, with bright eyes and a determined expression. He said he told her stories about her namesake, the aunt she'd never meet, who'd shown him what courage really looked like. My company continued to grow, but success felt different now. Every victory was sweeter because I knew exactly what failure tasted like. We expanded internationally, offices in London, Tokyo, Singapore. I spoke at conferences about resilience, about building something from nothing, though I never told the full story. That was mine to keep, the fuel that drove me when things got difficult. Maria retired from the food truck, but not from my life. She moved into a condo in my building, complaining about the fancy appliances while secretly loving having a dishwasher. She still cooked for me every Sunday, still called me mija, still threatened violence against anyone who hurt me. She was there when I won my first major business award, crying in the front row like the proud mother she'd chosen to be. Jennifer and I became business partners in multiple ventures, 2 women who'd been underestimated, turning that dismissal into an empire. We funded female entrepreneurs, particularly those with complicated backgrounds, those whose resumes had gaps that told stories of survival. We didn't ask them to explain their past, just to prove their future. James grew into a brilliant chief technology officer, his foster care background making him fiercely protective of the family we'd built at Phoenix Operations. Natasha's son graduated from MIT and came to work for us, bringing fresh ideas and the same hunger his mother had shown. Robert started a coding program for ex-convicts, teaching them the skills that had saved his life. We were all proof that second chances could create first-rate results. I started dating eventually, once therapy helped me understand that not everyone who said they loved me would throw me away. Alex was a civil rights lawyer who understood that family was complicated, that trust was earned, that love was shown through actions when words became worthless. He never pushed me to reconcile with my parents, never suggested forgiveness I wasn't ready to give. He just stood beside me as I continued building my life on the ashes of my past. The 5-year anniversary of the library meeting passed without fanfare. I only noticed because my assistant mentioned a call from someone named Margaret Sullivan that I declined to take. My parents still tried occasionally, letters I didn't open, calls I didn't answer, messages delivered through increasingly distant relatives. Each attempt reminded me that they still didn't understand. They thought time would soften my resolve, that success would make me generous, that blood would eventually call to blood. They didn't understand that they'd burned that bridge with nuclear fire, that some things couldn't be rebuilt, that forgiveness was mine to give or withhold. They didn't understand that I'd forgiven them years ago, not for their sake, but for mine to release the poison they'd put in my veins. But forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation. It didn't mean forgetting. It just meant I'd stopped letting their betrayal define my life. The last update I heard about them came from Kevin, always the involuntary messenger. They were still in Nebraska, still working, still alive. They'd joined a church, he said, telling everyone about their successful daughter in Chicago who was too busy changing the world to visit. Even in their humiliation, they'd found a way to claim credit for who I'd become. It was almost admirable, their commitment to revision, their ability to rewrite history, even when history was documented in federal court records. Diane would be eligible for parole in another 10 years. By then, I'd be in my 40s, probably married, maybe with children who'd never know they had grandparents in Nebraska or an aunt in federal prison. They'd know Maria as their grandmother, Jennifer as their aunt, my chosen family as their blood relatives. They'd grow up understanding that family was about choice, not chance, about love, not DNA, about showing up, not just sharing genes. Looking back, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if my parents had listened to me that day on their lawn, if they'd looked at the evidence, if they'd chosen truth over comfort. Maybe we'd have rebuilt something. Maybe I'd visit them on holidays. Maybe their final years would be spent surrounded by grandchildren instead of strangers in Nebraska. But that's not what happened. They made their choice, and that choice led me here, to this life I built from ruins, to this family I chose from fellow survivors, to this success that tastes like redemption. They gave me the gift of abandonment, and I transformed it into independence. They gave me the curse of betrayal, and I turned it into the blessing of knowing exactly who deserved my trust. The truth is, they were right about one thing. I did become someone different from the daughter they raised. I became someone stronger, someone who knew that rock bottom was just another foundation to build on. I became someone who understood that the family you choose is more powerful than the family you're born into. I became someone who could look at $400,000 in debt and see an opportunity to change lives instead of save the people who'd tried to end mine. They taught me that when someone shows you who they are, you should believe them the first time. They showed me they were people who could throw away 22 years of love based on lies they never questioned. They showed me they were people who valued comfort over truth, perception over reality, their favorite daughter over their reliable one. They showed me exactly who they were, and I believed them. So when they came begging for salvation 8 years later, I showed them exactly who I'd become without them. I showed them success they'd never share, forgiveness they'd never receive, and a family they'd never join. I showed them that the daughter they'd declared dead had been resurrected as someone they'd never recognize, someone who'd learned to save herself because no one else would. The donation plaque at the homeless shelter reads, "In honor of Richard and Margaret Sullivan, whose contribution will provide shelter for those who have nowhere else to turn." Every time someone sees it, they assume my parents are philanthropists, generous souls who care about the less fortunate. They don't know it's actually their daughter's money given in their name, because that's all they deserve from me, a tax write-off disguised as a legacy. The day I made that donation, I thought about the 22-year-old girl sleeping in her car, hungry and hopeless, abandoned by everyone who was supposed to love her. I thought about how she'd survived on spite and stubbornness, on the absolute refusal to let their cruelty be her conclusion. I thought about how she'd turned their absence into ambition, their betrayal into brilliance, their hatred into her own happiness. That girl deserved justice, and she got it. Not through revenge or cruelty, but through success that made their failure irrelevant. She got it through a life so full that their emptiness couldn't touch it. She got it through love that made their abandonment a gift in disguise. She got it through becoming someone they'd begged to know while never getting the chance. Some people say the best revenge is living well, and maybe that's true. But I think the best revenge is living so well that revenge becomes unnecessary, that the people who hurt you become footnotes in your success story. My parents wanted me to rot when they believed Diane's lies. Instead, I bloomed in soil they said was poisoned, growing into something they'd never be tall enough to reach. The last thing I'll say about this whole story is that pain can be a teacher if you're willing to learn its lessons. My parents taught me about betrayal, which taught me about loyalty. Diane taught me about lies, which taught me about truth. Homelessness taught me about hunger, which taught me about ambition. Rock bottom taught me about foundations, which taught me about building. Every terrible thing that happened led to something better, not because suffering is noble, but because I refused to let suffering be permanent. Every person who walked away created space for someone better to walk in. Every door that closed forced me to build my own doors. Every ending became a beginning I couldn't have imagined when I was 22 and dying in a parking lot. So thank you to my parents for choosing Diane's lies over my truth. Thank you for throwing me away like garbage. Thank you for teaching me that I didn't need you to be valuable. Thank you for the abandonment that became my independence. Thank you for the betrayal that became my boundary. Thank you for showing me exactly who you were so I could become exactly who I was meant to be. Without you, none of this would have happened. And that's the most honest thing I can say. If you've ever been betrayed by family, if you've ever been abandoned by those who should have protected you, if you've ever built yourself up from nothing while others tried to tear you down, I want to know your story. Leave a comment below sharing your experience. Have you forgiven those who hurt you, or did you choose to walk away like I did? Please hit that subscribe button if this story resonated with you, and like this video if you believe in chosen family over blood family. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they can survive betrayal and build something beautiful from the ruins. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, sometimes the best thing toxic people can do for you is show you exactly who they are, so you can show them exactly who you can become without them.